You will never play Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn. Even if you wanted to, you literally can't. The game simply does not exist. In the same way, thanks to patch 6.2, you'll never be able to play Heavensward again. Not even in New Game Plus. I mean, if you want to split hairs, you technically couldn't. Like, this has been the case since, I think, 2.1, 3.1, you know, because of system changes. And, of course, the entirety of A Realm Reborn was actually built on the same principle of you can't play 1.0 again. But the problem is getting more and more intense. Note, I didn't say worse, I said more intense. Content is being replaced, but it's a good thing. And this is what we could call the Ship of Theseus approach to game development, or at least that's what I'm calling it. And it's theoretically the most un-MMO approach you could possibly be taking to video games, because it costs way too much time, it costs way too much money, and it potentially leaves your most dedicated players out. But as Creative Business Unit 3 are setting out to prove, it's also the best. First, I should run through exactly what I mean here. I literally, just today, I got done trying out the new Heavensward changes, the ones in 6.2, and holy shit. You know the way people say they wish they could like wipe their memories clean and play a game fresh for the first time? What I would not give for that right now with what they've done. With the duty support, meaning that you now get to actually party with Sail, Stinian, and Horsefont, as well as like Alphino in his little shitty baby boy form. You get to listen to their dialogue in dungeons, the updated cutscenes and stuff like that with them, actually engaging with the dungeons and stuff. It feels like such a drastic improvement, especially with just a little bit they added to the post-vault cutscene with that healing. And then even the gameplay, it's so much better. From like 2.0 all the way to like Stormblood maybe. They never seemed to figure out what a dungeon boss actually was, but now they've reworked like the annoying ones from Heavensward, like the most annoying ones, the ones that you don't really know anything about. The Snowball Yeti that no one understood at all unless they were a veteran. The T-Rex with the exploding blood that no one ever killed properly. This, whatever this was with Midgardsormr, this fucking nightmare, whatever the hell this gas dragon was, all of these things are so different. Now they look like this, there should be footage rolling. They're so much better. It like beggars belief how much more like Stormblood-esque, Shadowrings-esque they feel, and it's so much better. That said, the area changes are a bit of a downgrade on Nidhogg. As much as doing a dungeon with a Stinian is fun, that final fight is clearly a lot worse as a result. That old eye shield moment was pure unadulterated Kino. Anyway, by the time they're done with all these changes, there won't be a single bad experience left in the whole game. Even Good King Mugglemog in Thornmarch actually makes sense now. It's substantially easier, but the rework makes like it fits as an ARR trial. It actually fits now instead of whatever it was before. That's kind of mad. But while we're here, I want to reach into like some other MMOs, and I want to talk about how this approach, this Ship of Theseus stuff, is simultaneously 5,000 IQ, but also extremely, extremely brave. Josh Drive Hayes recently spoke to Chris Wilson of Path of Exile. Yes, it's an MMO. Yeah. They brought up the fact that expansions incredibly make MMOs smaller usually. And obviously, this is kind of obvious, right? Expansions have to be smaller than the base game. But the idea of relevant content in MMOs, especially in the end game driven ones, is super important. It might be like the most important thing. MMO players are obviously ravenous. They'll exhaust every drop of content and immediately hunger for more. Because the entire genre is for monogamers. The reputation of a game lives and dies on the word of mouth of like the most intense, the most dedicated, the hardcore players talking about it. It's that like fervent, this game's great, play it with us, that like draws people in. Almost in the same way that bouncers in like clubs will let attractive women like skip the queue, but that's because having like the desirable or the aspirational thing will make others want to join. The approach just works, right? It works in clubs and it works in MMOs. And now MMOs and like some other live service games, they have persistent updates that add new content that just keep players fed and watered, keep them happy, like their little, I guess, hamsters trapped in the corner on the hamster wheel. But the ones with the most consistent updates win. Over in live service shooters, Apex Legends recently found itself a new peak of concurrent players. And it was like a new peak years after launch is kind of crazy for a game like that. And it's because they found a pace of updates that keeps content coming, but importantly gives them room to make the content better and feeling like fresh. Every single time it feels like, oh, that's cool, I want to play that. And it's kind of the same with League of Legends, life ruining memes aside. Every time these teams add like a new item, a new champion, a new map mechanic, it usually avoids like the mistakes of the predecessors, right? They kind of go, well, that didn't work, so let's not do that again, let's try this. And to put this simply, every time they try something, they're grinding their craft. They're grinding like crazy, their skill levels rising, and it shows. But it does raise a pretty notable problem in those specific games, and that's power, complexity, and design creep, as well as new work being so much better that the old work looks awful. You kind of see that in FF, right, where A Realm Reborn's kind of shit comparatively, and sometimes like old stuff in those games will be meta and still fun, subjectively, but objectively new stuff tends to be better. But for non-MMOs, that's not a problem, because they just get to play with the new stuff, right? You're playing League, you go in, oh, one of the new champions will be on the free rotation, or you play Apex and Legend won't be that hard to get, there you go. They'll feel left out when like veterans are going, oh, back in my day when Garen didn't have any interesting mechanics, or Annie just point and click stunned at whatever. That stuff is like, that's interesting, but basically they get to close a small knowledge gap and a large skill gap to play those games. And in MMOs, new players are scuffed, basically. It's a completely different story. There's linear progression and how you're funneled to the end game. In like every single way in MMOs, instead of a skill gap, there's a knowledge gap. Fully appreciating the game is like, it's all about knowing all of the years of content, story, locations, characters, classes, items, meta. All of that stuff is important, but it's also basically impossible. At least not without someone guiding you. The new player who logs into an MMO goes, what the fuck is this? How am I supposed to learn all of this? And that's only if they're lucky enough to know that there's stuff they don't know. The genre itself is plagued by tons of like unknown unknowns, so you could play for years, and I mean there's stuff in FF and World of Warcraft that hits me this way, where you're like, how have I been playing this for years and not know that? What? And that's what makes them kind of hard to get into. So obviously, what's the solution, right? The solution is just don't look at any of that rundown stuff, just get straight into the new content. And World of Warcraft's probably the strongest example of that. Blizzard are fully aware that old things are out of date and no longer do the job or no longer fun, can't sort of float in today's market. So they just say, oh, 14 years of game? No, don't worry. Straight into the new tutorial, which feels fresh, is pretty new. And then straight into BFA. Straight into Shadowlands, or soon enough, straight into Dragonflight. And even like they sell a character boost so people can skip right to the endgame and ignore all of that content. The gameplay staples aren't taught because the level up experience isn't designed for that. It's just old content smashed together. The story context is impossible to get. Timelines are confusing at best. And like all in all, the game is just too ashamed of its past to give players like the best long-term experience, which is loving the game, warts and all. You don't get to fall in love with World of Warcraft because they go, nope, just ignore all our bad parts straight into the new stuff, which is one way to do it. And sure, they've taken major steps to like improve or at least change fundamental stuff like talents and class designs over the years. Like, I guess all live services kind of do that, altering the core as well as introducing new content. But it's all in favor of the new experience, and it's not really like ideal for that. Now, obviously, catering to existing players is a good move, but if it comes at the expense of a great experience for new players, then we run into basically MMO's biggest problems. Long-term user retention versus churn. Now, Yoshi P talked about this in his Famitsu column, and here are some select juicy quotes. MMORPGs that ride the wave of stable management will be forced to grapple with player tedium. Everything develops tedium. No matter how much you love a certain food, if you eat it every day for every meal, you'll not only get tired of it, at some point you'll come to hate it. Of course, boredom is subjective. People who feel that every day is a fresh experience because they can discover new things and surprises on their own, they tend to not get bored of things. They're the kind of people, they can see everything in a positive light. Most people are not like this. Most people gradually succumb to boredom and then cannot escape its clutches. What's worse is that this boredom comes even faster the more stable your lifestyle is, because there are no new stimuli. He said all of these things while musing on FF14 hitting its third year in live in 2.0, and then needing to figure out how to retain users after they hit their stride. And of course, most service games answer this with more varied content, more releases, and a wider range of things to do. Dragonflight, as an example for Blizzard, brings dragon riding, which is a brand new form of traversal that threatens, promises to shake up how you get around the world. There's a new class and a new form of input, literally a whole new way to hold buttons down. And they're also working on exploration content out in the world instead of just dungeons and raids. FF14, of course, Island Sanctuary, entire new minigame. The variant dungeons and all their difficulties are coming in 6.2.5. And back to our early examples, Apex keeps updates feeling fresh, new modes, different experiments in design, different map stuff. Literally just, we can't let players be bored. But that's a mitigating strategy, right? It's like your bathroom's falling to pieces, so you add extra rooms to your house. No matter what happens, basically, even when you're at your peak of development, life isn't that simple. And I mean that literally. People will leave for a variety of reasons, good or bad, and they might never come back. Jeremy Gaffney, the ex-performance unit head at Blizzard for World of Warcraft specifically, and the veteran at Turbine, NCSoft, and Carbine, famously said when he was talking about WildStar that even a good game loses about 5% of users per month, saying that they theoretically, and this is very theoretically, replace their entire user base worth of players, by numbers at least, in under 2 years. Now, that specific number seems to come from an analyst talking about World of Warcraft 2007, but Gaffney, who was in the business, was happy to reiterate it in 2014, so I'm assuming there's at least some truth behind it. And then also in 2014, Yoshi P in one of his columns suggested that increased adoption of F2P and a greater number of competitors has decreased retention massively for sub-based MMOs, based on internal data they got and whatever analysts they speak to. In 2010, it was 6 months of retention, but by 2014, it was down to 80 days. That was 8 years ago, so we can imagine the market's way more brutal, lots more free to play, lots more competition. You assume it's a lot faster now. And that's good for new players as a whole, because competition, more games, more new player experience is great, but it's grim for diehard players of individual games. Now, of course, none of these producer data loving types can talk about how many players return to games, but taking a look at this data that we gathered earlier, the Lucky Bancho stuff, FF14 over time has a massive churn rate, but also a huge amount of returning players. So clearly all of the musing that Yoshida does on retention actually kind of worked. And I mean, obviously, we could talk for an hour or so and the philosophy of if you love them, let them go works for FF14. But we have actually a completely different group of players to talk about, because it's hard to think about them, it's difficult to think about them, but there's the equation that combats churn, and new players are part of it. No matter how good your game is, players will leave. To assume otherwise is literally just pure hubris. It's sometimes it's not even your game's fault that someone leaves. Someone's oh, your competition's great, your game's maybe great, whatever. People just quit. They go look after their family, they go focus on their careers or school, or even just replace gaming habits with different ones. That literally just happens. And then you have to do something about that, because that is literally, as a developer, that's your problem. And now let's use an analogy that's definitely completely accurate to get to the next point. You're dropped on a fairly large desert island, right? You've got a limited supply of food, limited water, and you must survive until you're rescued soon. What was your first instinct? I bet none of you said, I'll consider how I can conserve my energy and my water usage. That'll let me ration my supplies until I'm rescued. That's not a bad strategy, but it's a defensive one. I'd wager that most of you roughly correctly, said, I would look for food, I would look for water, I'd look for sources. That's what FF14 is doing. It's looking for food and water in the desert of MMO land. If it isn't good enough, it gets fixed. That's the Creative Business Unit 3 approach, and it's naturally the approach for most developers, but Yoshi P and his squad do it a little bit differently. Not good enough doesn't just apply to work they're doing right now, but it also applies to work they've already done and already released. They've already ticked it off in the done pile, the budget pile is yep, that's not good enough, we need to fix it. They know that the long game is the only one worth playing. So back to my opener, but the ship of Theseus. For a quick explainer, that's a thought experiment as to whether an object that has had all of its parts replaced is still basically the same object. It's interesting to think about with regards to, the transhumanism, identity, the passage of time, growth and stuff like that. But to me, it's a little bit more than just a brain tickler. It's actually like a bit of wisdom, right? It hides a good moral message. The idea is that if this one ship was preserved for generations and generations, because every single time a plank started to decay, started to rot, they replaced it with new, stronger wood because, you know, techniques for stronger wood get better over time. That's how they're building this game, right? If something old isn't good enough to sail in today's very turbulent MMO waters, it gets replaced with something new. And that something new is always, because they've been grinding their craft, it's always a hell of a lot better. Because they're 10 years, a decade more experienced, and also have more budget. And what that means is, while most MMOs and evolving games suffer from being mostly made of like rotten planks, and the difference between the new shiny planks over here, like the difference between them is getting like more obvious every expansion, FF14 is actively going, oh, these rotten planks, replace them with clean planks, replace them with the best we have. Because the last video we did on the changes that happened in A Realm Reborn towards the end, a lot of people in the comments, a lot of you were agreeing it feels better. One of the worst player experiences possible in the entire game is now one of the, maybe one of the best is exaggerating, but it's one of like, it's a really strong moment now. And that's happening to Heavensward. Slowly but surely, of course. But man, like I felt it. I would love to be a new player. That doesn't work for any other game I play. Any other game, like if I were a new player and I came in here, I would be noped out immediately. I'd be, nah. For World of Warcraft, the new player experience is, they sort of try, but it's grim. Even for the likes of like, even for Apex, even for League of Legends, even for those games where new players have a little bit to go, it's like, there's too much. There's too much going on. But for FF14, I would love a chance to experience that again, especially because it's so much better. It's crazy how much better it is now. And that's part of their whole strategy. Instead of like in all these other MMOs where you're funneled to the end game, you miss all the context of the story and the world, in FF you get the whole thing. And when that isn't good enough for you, they devote resources to go back and make sure it is. And that's a strategy ultimately to ensure that every new player that picks up the game in the free trial or otherwise, referral maybe, they find a reason to stick around. That's on the desert island, that's going to find the fresh food and water. Well, maybe in this analogy they're less finding it, more they're digging a well and starting a farm to, you know, produce it. But it's that idea of they know that they need to do this for the future. And like, it's not hurting their ability to make new content, right? It doesn't seem that way, but that's resources going back there. So clearly, like that's the kind of thing where clearly it's going to be impacting some of their stuff. It's maybe going to push something down a later patch because resources, right? Like if they literally didn't have those, I guess an example is if they didn't have to do those cutscenes for the vault and stuff and for those dungeons, could they have added more cutscenes to MSQ? Could they have added some more cutscenes to Abyssos? Maybe some of the side quests are running late. Maybe some of it was supposed to be here. But no, they decided, no, we're going to, hopefully they weren't. Maybe they like worked overtime or, you know, crunched on it or something. But that stuff is like, they went back and they did it because they know that the new players are just as important, if not more important, than the most dedicated ones that are already playing. It's a fine line to walk, but it seems like they've learned how to walk it actually quite well. To bring it back to the ship of Theseus comparison, you can see why the idea of like replacing the bad parts is so deeply ingrained in their philosophy, because that's literally how they started, right? FF14 was a sinking ship. They were handed this awful sinking ship that was rotten to the core and ready to destroy, and they had to rebuild it from the ground up while keeping the name and keeping like the vibe, the experience close enough to the same. And they've been doing that on like system and gameplay levels for like years now too. New players, as an example, will never have to experience the sheer suffering that was TP for weapon skills, technical points, basically a physical mana bar. Sprint depleted your TP, so non-casters couldn't use it in combat except in like dire emergencies because it meant you couldn't attack for a while. And then AoE skills cost more than your regen rate, so you couldn't spam AoEs as either a melee or a tank. You just single targeted in like 5 mobs for aggro and damage, and it wasn't fun. In fact, that's actually one of the reasons I quit the game. One of the first times I played Warrior for a good while, and in early Heavensward, just after the expansion launched, I was tanking, and it was frustrating the hell out of me not being able to just press overpower. I had to mark mobs individually, and that was awful. And the other experience was another one they fixed, which was Praetorium. Praetorium was skippable cutscenes in its old form, completely ruined the dramatic ending of Realm Reborn for me. Between that and not enjoying dungeon tanking, it was like, no, this is grim. Those things churned me out, but both are fixed. If I started playing the game today again, well, it's a weird hypothetical, but if I started playing the game again, I wouldn't be hit by that wall. It would be substantially better. And that ensures fresh meat. The rotten planks that I fell through, better content, better gameplay, better everything. And that's what I think the FF14's planned for the future. That's the shape of a Theseus approach. Eventually, everything wrong with FF14 will be replaced. It'll be a different game. It'll have different mechanics. It'll have different bosses, different boss fights. It already does. Different dungeon layouts like we've seen, different lighting in dungeons, and different story experiences, hopefully only slightly. And it'll be healthier for it. As long as we players who play it, I mean, I'm relatively new starting fully in Shadowbringers, but like, as long as we have a corner of this room where you get to say, oh, you kids don't know how good you had it. Praetorium used to be miles up in the snow, uphill both ways. As long as we keep that, that's fine. And as one exciting final note, turns out being able to replace most of the ship isn't actually good enough. Yoshi P said in a recent interview that he's a madman. He wants to build one more MMO from scratch before he dies. And I think everyone would wish him luck in that, and everyone would love to see that happen with all the knowledge and like skill that he and his team now have. I'm sure it'd be one of the best ever made. I look forward to FF16 because that's like his team again, and that's going to be incredible. Though I don't appreciate the reminder of the inevitable march of time when that man. I hope that man outlives me. I don't want to be there in the FF14 community when he goes. That'll be a very, very sad day. But I'm sure that won't be for many, many years, as long as he actually gets some sleep every now and again. But yeah, that's the ship of Theseus approach. That's how FF14 is planned for the future, with a 5,000 IQ move that technically is risky and no other MMO is like capable of doing it because, well, fundamentally because it's expensive. And the only reason FF gets away with it is because they have the production capacity, because Yoshi P and his production squad are inhuman and probably work like 15 hours a day, which is not good, but it's how it is. It is. Glenn Schofield of the East. Glenn Schofield of the East, for anyone who's paying attention to game industry drama on Twitter. But yeah, no, that's the thought I had when going through the new changes, and they are all fairly positive changes outside of the Nidhogg fight. So, I mean, like, what do you think? Did you start playing recently with the big wave of like, I guess, Realm Reborn changes, or are you a veteran who like remembers how shit it was back then and like kind of wears the badge with pride? Like, yeah, I remember the nightmare that was Good King Mogomog. I progged that when it was fresh and no one had any idea and no one had any gear and all the melds were wrong. And what was it from Heavensward? It was like tanks used to not be able to wear tank accessories because they were so shit because they had tenacity, and instead they wore the DPS ones, and that kind of threw off all their damage calculations, and none of the game worked. And also Bard was Bow Mage in Heavensward, which was really fun and cool, but also had loads of like problems for mobility, and people were a little bit weird about it. And was it Monk basically didn't exist in raiding, and Alexander almost killed everything. Man, FF14 was a pretty bad game. Even when it was good, it was pretty bad. But I mean, that's it, right? That's it. I get to say all that, and then I get to turn around and say, it's all fixed. It's all fixed now. What an approach. God, what an approach. They're brave. They're brave, but they make it work. Anyway, I'm kind of just rambling now. Thank you very much for watching this. Leave your comments and stuff below. And once again, I'll trying to amp up content in this channel. Maybe I'll try to branch out a little bit further, but now that I'm not fucking sick, it's great. So yes, I will see you again very, very soon, and have a great day.